A very good evening and welcome to the 31st webinar in the ICFI's Wise Views Interactive Webinar Series. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have an extremely distinguished thought leader. He's going to speak about the crisis in financial management in the world and what are the implications for growth for Indian business. This is going to be a heavy talk. This is going to be a very interesting talk given the speaker. I'm very, very thankful Mr. Mohan Guruswamy has accepted to spend this time with us in spite of his busy schedule. Welcome, sir. Welcome to this interactive webinar series.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm joined by Professor R. Prasad. He is the Director for Academic
Good evening, sir.
Hello, Dr. Prasad.
And I take this opportunity to welcome all those participants who have joined from across the country, from various institutions or organizations, from various walks of life. Without wasting any further time, what I will do is I'll quickly introduce the guest, and after that, we'll hand it over to Mr. Mohan Guruswamy to start his talk. I will share my screen. This talk, as we usually do, we were doing this at 6:30 p.m. every Friday, but this time we are experimenting in terms of the timings. We moved it to 7:30 p.m. Now, we thought that 7:30 p.m. is little more comfortable, convenient to various people. As I mentioned, Mr. Mohan Guruswamy is going to talk about the crisis in world financial management. The agenda, as I said, from 7:30 to 7:50 p.m., roughly about 20 minutes will be the talk delivered by the guest, and the remaining 40 minutes for the Q&A moderated by me and my esteemed colleague, Mr. Prasad. Briefly about Mr. Mohan, he has been an alumnus of some of the prestigious institutes like Nizam College in India to John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and the Graduate School of Business, Stanford University. Mr. Mohan Guruswamy had an interesting career path that included teaching, senior management, journalism, and in government as advisor to the finance minister with the rank of secretary to the government of India. His astute analytical expertise is well known. Mr. Mohan is widely traveled in India and abroad and is the author of several books on policy issues, and some of the recent books being The Looming Crisis in India's Agriculture, India Issues in Development, India's World, Essays in Foreign Policy and Security Issues, India-China Relations, The Border Issue and Beyond, and the last, The Chasing the Dragon, Will India Catch Up with China? He is a frequent commentator on national and international TV and radio on matters of current interest and writes a widely read and disseminated newspaper and magazine column. His papers on redefining poverty, income inequality, backwardness of Bihar, economic development in West Bengal, FDI in retail have been published in well-regarded journals like the famous Economic and Political Weekly, Seminar, and the Journal of Public Policy UK. So we are extremely fortunate to have Mr. Mohan Guruswamy. Thank you, sir, once again. And I will now stop sharing the screen here. And I'll request sir to initiate his talk. Once again, on behalf of everyone at ICFI and also on behalf of all the participants, I thank you and welcome you, sir, for this talk. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sudhakar, for having me today. I'm nicely retired in Yapra. I don't have a busy schedule, so whenever people call me, I'm quite happy to sit and talk to them, particularly since I've been keeping solitary imprisonment by myself because of the lockdown. Anyway, I'll start with the world as we're seeing it. Actually, the subject itself has been wrongly labeled by me because there is no crisis in the world financial system. It's functioning quite well. But it is functioning like a system which has a very weak foundation. So any slight rocking can send it tumbling down. I'll show you why. We saw what happened when Lehman Brothers collapsed. We saw what happened when the Asian contagion took place. Slight trembles and things collapse. It's finely balanced. And it functions on a basic anomaly, and I'll point out that also to you. But let's start from the year zero, when all the world's economies were together. this is how they stacked up. Please have chart 1. So you can see that, countries have been going up and down. There was a moment in 1620 when the Emperor of India was Aurangzeb. Yeah, 1620, when Aurangzeb was the Emperor of Delhi. India was the world's biggest economic power. And since then, we've been coming down. The British came, the English came, and then, the slide down is evident till 1950, where we were rock bottom, about 4.7% of world GDP. That was our share from almost 36%. And since then, we've been growing. And in 2020, we are about 8%. And the outlook is looking pretty good, because if we continue to climb at this rate, China will reach China's GDP by about 2050, and will be a little ahead of the United States also. So next, please. So the prospects are good for this economy, but will the world economy stay? That is the big question. Now, in 2018, the world GDP was 84.8 trillion and growing at 3.6%. During the past 8 years, the world GDP grew at 4% a year. Now, it was only 1.1 trillion in 1900, and it took half a century to grow to 4 trillion. And then it grew tenfold in the next 40 years to grow to 41 trillion. It's now 84 trillion because last 2 years have been slow for the world economy, and it has remained pretty much where it was. The big leaps actually began, if you look at the data, when President Richard Nixon unilaterally delinked the US dollar from the international gold standard. Now that happened because of the Yom Kippur war between Israel and the Arab countries. And the Arabs suddenly hiked the price of petroleum. And what was costing a few cents, 30 cents a barrel, suddenly began costing $6 or $7 a barrel, and it started moving upwards. And this actually made all economies very dysfunctional. Suddenly, they were all scrambling for money to pay for oil. And suddenly the Arabs were having lots of money sitting in American banks. So President Nixon actually felt that the dollar must now be delinked from the international gold standard, and then began this great leap forward in world economies. The world economy, the dollar had a different kind of value, and the number of dollars in the market kept increasing. And I'll show you more of that. Next, please. Now, the world is the world of trade. Together, imports and exports amount to about $39 trillion. Yeah, and this is after process of globalization. And one of the biggest reasons for this is the US has become a great consumer. The world has got hooked on to selling to the United States. Now, the world trade is now 37.7 trillion and growing at 2.6%. China, including Hong Kong, is the biggest player, accounting for 5.3 trillion of world trade. The top 5 global traders account for 19.11 or 50% of global trade. So it's very concentrated in a few countries: USA, Germany, Japan, China, and EU. If you can see, EU is actually a bigger world trade player than the US. Next, please. Now, this is how exports have been going up. You see how sharply from 1970 they started growing up, because there were suddenly more dollars in hands of other people, particularly the Arabs. The dollars now then start, I show you the process, start going to American banks. And from American banks, they go out to other parts of the world. And exports suddenly start becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. It's only in the last 2 years, because of the pandemic and other reasons, they've slowed down a bit. Next, please. And this is how the trend goes between exports and imports. There's always a little gap, and I'll show you where that gap goes. Next, please. And this is what we are buying and selling: animal, vegetable, animal food, vegetables, fruit, food products, mining products, chemicals, fuels, plastic, rubber products, wood products, textiles and clothing, machinery, electric electrical goods, and there's transportation, which is aviation, things like that, and metallurgy. Now, this is where the big value addition takes place, because here is where there's conversion of raw materials into finished goods, like automobiles or whatever, which has huge value additions. Next, please. So whoever has more of this actually gets huge value additions. Now, these are the big economies in the world now. United States, China, Japan, Germany, UK, India 6. If you take it PPP, India is somewhere here 3. Next, please. Yeah, so as you can see, the world is going to be in transition. Where we are today is going to be very different from where we are going to be in 2050. 2050 is only 30 years away. And in 2050, this is how the world will start looking. China would be the world's biggest economy with $59 trillion as GDP. And India will be number 2 at $43 trillion. US is $37 trillion. Brazil 9, Japan. So it's a completely different world. The countries which were on top are suddenly going to be somewhere else. And then you have new players coming in. Vietnam is going to have a higher growth rate than India. There's Nigeria, which is going to go fast. Chinese growth rate is going to keep coming down. Indonesia is coming up. Turkey, a whole bunch of new players. Now the big old countries, their growth is going to slow down. And as I'll show you later, their share of the world economy is also coming down. So it's going to be a very different world in economic terms in 30 years from now. And if you can see the rankings in 2009, and you see the rankings now, it's a very different set of rankings. Now, this is the rise and fall of world merchandise trade. 2001, this was the trade, and this was the GDP. And they're evening out now, pretty much at the same level. The GDPs have been pretty static relatively, but trade has been going up and down. But the last 5 years, they're at holding level ground and growing at about 3% a year. Now, this is the changing share of the world. You see the rising power now is Asia. Asia in 2005 had 35% of world. By 2050, Asia will be close to 55%. European Union will shrink, United States will shrink, rest of the world will be pretty much where they are. So the power equations, economic power equations are going to change in the world quite dramatically, which is why you see when economic power equations change, generally what happens is power equations also begin to change in the world. So you can see the rise of China is linked to its economic power. And China is today able to challenge the United States because it's pretty close to the United States in terms of GDP. It was not like the Cold War power equations when the Soviet Union was much smaller than the US in terms of GDP, but could still challenge it. China's power comes from its economic power. And that is going to make it a very different world. Now, you can see how the world is changing here. Who contributed how much to the world growth in this decade we just passed through? The world, China contributed 26% of world growth. This was the incremental GDP of China in those 10 years, $14 trillion. And that is 26% of the world GDP growth in that period. United States was $7 trillion, 12.8, European Union 10, India, interestingly enough, 9.9. That year, that decade, or 2010 to 2020, was quite remarkable for India because we were growing at about till we slowed down at well over 7%. And now this is beginning to be threatened. Indonesia is rising. So the growth, incremental growth to the world is coming here, this big five. Now, we're all buying from each other and we are mostly selling to the United States. So where is our money going? Now, this is where we keep our money, or the total foreign exchange reserves in the world, which is about $12 trillion. The United States has $11 trillion. United States has almost $7 trillion, which is about 63% of that. Euro is $22 trillion. Nobody holds money in any of the other currencies. China has only $2.3 billion, no, $23 billion. Japanese yen, little more. Pound sterling coming down. Swiss francs down. Other currencies very low. So predominantly world reserves are held in these two, dollars and euro, and dollars increasingly. And this is how the currencies have been allocated as reserves in 2021 last quarter. United dollars is the big one, and dollars is what we trust, just like we trust God, we trust dollar. And dollar is absolute king. And euro and dollar are quite interchangeable because they, these two economies, currency economies, act in concert. This is a flow from 1999. The dollar has been losing ground as reserves, but still pretty much there on top. Euro has been coming down, and you can see the Japanese yen increasing little space, pound sterling also asserting itself a bit, but dollar is still the mighty king. Everybody prefers to keep their money in dollars. All international trade is done in dollars, and we keep the dollars in American banks where we think is very safe. Next, please. Now, composition of dollar reserves, I've been telling you. US dollar is still there, 62% in 2018. Next, please. So where are the foreign exchange reserves? As of last month, China had $3.4 trillion. Japan had $1.4 trillion, coming down a bit. Switzerland has $1 trillion, mostly other people's money. India has 640 billion. Russia 626 billion. Taiwan 544. Hong Kong. You add Hong Kong to China, you're looking at something very big, almost $4 trillion. South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Brazil, and Germany. These are the big 12 in terms of their reserves, money where they are. But you notice here something which is very interesting. United States is not here. United States, because it is a dollar economy, doesn't need to hold reserves. Actually, the total foreign reserves, the United States is $230 billion. Everybody's putting their money in American banks. It doesn't need to keep dollars in any other people's bank. So it's got all the dollars it needs. And it has got 5 printing presses. The Reserve Bank and all other banks, major currencies in the world have 1 printing press. The US has 4 Feds, 5 Feds. Now the total world reserves 12.8. And I went through these figures. I'm just summarizing what I showed you till now. All these reserves are held by individual countries in the form of bonds, mostly earning a very small interest rate. In the United States, if you get 1%, you're very lucky. Actually, in many bonds, you get 0. This is like money invested in a bank, but in reality, it is being money lent to the issuing country. Now, this is something we must remember. We are all lending money to the United States. Since the reserves are mostly in US dollars and euros, the issuing countries have little reason to hold as much reserves. US reserves account, see, I told you, 130 billion. Contrast this to India's 641 and China's 332. The last figure will tell you how much China has invested in the US and how much leverage the US can exercise over China to ensure compliant behavior. Actually, I was once at a conference in Beijing, and the Chinese Vice Minister for Foreign Economic Affairs asked me as a question, when I was sitting on the dais, he asked me, what will happen to the dollars if we ask the United States to return it back? I said, they will laugh at you. First, they won't give it back to you. 2, if you take it back, you will have to bring it back to your economy. You have to demonetize it into your currency, and then you will have hyperinflation. So you're stuck. So you, as a revolutionary, you should ask yourself the question, why did you exploit the working class so much and leave the money with the capitalists? Now, all this money is sitting with America. And what does America do with it? America, emerging countries like India hold 6.8 trillion. So what is actually happening in practice is we all put this money in America. They go to American banks in dollars. And what do the banks do? The banks lend it to American citizens who can buy goods for themselves. Now, US is the most indebted country. The average American citizen, his personal debt is about $53,000. The credit card debt of the United States is about $50 billion. The US is hugely indebted. And the system is we have so much of confidence in the US that we keep giving money to the US. So the money, you can imagine what happens. It goes to Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley will lend it to First National Bank of California. First National Bank in California or Wells Fargo will have thousands of account holders who it gives credit to, it has credit cards, and they will go to buy goods in Walmart. And then from Walmart, they place the order on China. And from China, it comes to America. The surplus which China gets then goes to the American bank. So it's a cyclical system. Now, if Walmart was the country, it would be the US's third biggest exporter. The Walmart alone exports from China, exports to America goods worth $85 billion a year. So where is that money coming from? It's your money, it's my money, it's Saudi Arabia's money, it's China's money, India's money, Russia's money, Arab money, all which goes to the United States because we trust the United States and it's secure, so we put our money there. Even today, if you had a choice, if you were offered Chinese currency or American currency, whose currency would you hold? Think about it in personal terms. We all prefer dollar. So when the US is short, we just saw that last month, it just prints some more dollars, which the rest of us lap up quite happily. The US is now injecting $1.9 trillion into the economy to build infrastructure. Then they will buy cement from us, they'll buy steel from us, they'll buy bridge trusses from us, they'll buy wiring from us, copper wire, aluminum wire. Everything will go from all over the world, particularly from China, which is the world's factory. And you need software for that. So software will go from India. And each time the US goes into convulsions because of this dependency on them and its profligacy and economic mismanagement, the world goes into a tailspin. Because the USA is the world's biggest importer, and it is where the world keeps its money. There are two things you must remember. That without the United States, we're all dead. Without the United States mismanaging its economy and having a balance of payments deficit year after year, our economies will slow down. Our export economies will slow down. We're all hooked on to a basic dysfunction in the United States. World trade is supposed to be balanced. You're supposed to import as much as you export. But here what we're having is, since we're doing it in the US currency alone, the US can afford to have a basic economic imbalance. If we had trade deficits like this in India, or current account deficits like this in India, we would collapse. We would have collapsed a long time ago. What is going to happen to all our reserves? The US has just now announced that it will devalue the dollars by 33% over the next 20 years, which means an increase of 2% a year of this will lead to a 50% increase in the price level. So we're looking at a world where price levels are going to keep going up, and it will take $132 to purchase the same basket of goods for $100, which we can buy for $100 today. So what will be called the dollar in 2030 will be worth 1/3 less. So this is another fact of life. Each time you hold a dollar, you can keep buying less. So each time the longer you keep your dollar in American banks, the less you can buy. Now, this is how the system actually works. How much of time, how am I doing on time? Countries like China and India produce goods and services at low cost for consumption in the USA, which in turn pays them in dollars, which they in turn deposit in US banks. Now, how do you visualize this? Close your eyes for a moment and think that we're all on an island. On that island, India makes shirts, somebody else makes shoes, somebody else makes toasters, somebody else makes cars, somebody else makes motorbikes, lithium batteries, or whatever. And there's one guy who's making notes, printing notes, and giving it to all of us. We are exchanging that notes among ourselves for exchange of goods, and we're giving that, we're giving that guy goods for his notes. So the notes we take from him, we exchange with each other. Since money cannot sit still, the money in US banks is then lent to Americans, who today have the highest per capita indebtedness in the world, to splurge on houses, cars, plasma TVs, computers, and PlayStations, which they can often ill afford. If you compute their salaries, no Indian bank would lend in American money, because they will not meet our requirements. But in America, everybody is indebted. And if you're not indebted, then they think there's something wrong with you. So credit is very important in America. And we're all living on the US credit. And this is the historical US trade deficit from 1989. They used to have a $5 billion trade deficit. Now they have a $6 trillion $579 billion trade deficit. So this is how it keeps widening. And this is where we people get our economic growth from, in this gap. So the more this gap is, the better it is for us. If the US wants to keep its economy in order, we'll start decreasing this, and then we will get squeezed further. So this is basic dysfunction in the global system. We're all dependent on the basic flaw of the United States system of trade. They have deficits, we enjoy the deficits. Now this is the US imbalance with the trade. It doesn't have a trade surplus with anybody in the world, Nobody. Canada, look at this, 292 exports, 324. With all the top 15 countries, $1 trillion export, $1.7 trillion import. Even with India, this is merchandise goods. And then if you add India's $110 billion software export, you're looking at a bigger imbalance. And this is what we're all thriving upon. In addition to this, there's something else happening in the world. The profile of the world in demographic terms is changing. Now, this is what I call the wheels of life. Is when we are young, you're a baby, you have somebody looking after you, putting you in a pram and walking you around. Then you get a little bicycle and you go floating around the neighborhood. And then you go out to school or wherever you go on your bike. This is the phase of life when you are dependent on your family. Your parents look after you. Your father, mother go to work, support you. And this is when you're in a dependent stage. The next stage is when you finish this, go to work, buy yourself a car, get a bigger car, you get a family, then you retire and go around the countryside. This is when you're at your more productive phase. This is the age between, say, 21 to about 65. This is when you're saving, you're consuming, your incomes are going up, you're saving more, you're consuming more. And this is when you are retiring, you have lots of funds, and you're spending. It's a very good phase for an economist. We call this the most interesting part. Then the dependency starts again. You need retirement, you need ambulatory nursing and nursing. When you get old, then you're not contributing to society, you're eating up your savings. So we call these two stages dependency factors. So when this dependency factor goes over this, the economy will start slowing down. Now this is what is happening. Next, please. In many places in the world. Now this was Japan in 1950. It had a lot of young people, very few old people, and the productive cohort was very high, 20 plus, very high. This is what happened in 2004. Yep. The dependency ratio increased, and now the dependency ratio is increased again. Now, now what we've got today is Japan with 40% of its people above the age of 65. They are not producing anything. They are using up their savings and they're dependent on others to support their economy and support them. When you have a profile like this, you're just not going to grow. So whatever Japan does, whatever pump priming it does, there's no consumption. So economic growth has been flat almost for 10 years in Japan. Just unless demographics of countries change, you're not going to have economic growth. Next, please. Now, this is the structures of China and India. We were like this in 2000, China and India. Look at how our younger cohort is high and the dependency cohort is less. And this is moving very fast into this stage. We call this the demographic dividend. Provided they're productive, all of them are going to be productive. The more productive they are, the faster will be your economic growth. So you keep looking at these pyramids. There's a basic difference between the Chinese pyramid and ours. China has started slowing down demographically. Their dependency factors are going up. And this is what China will look like in 2035. And this is what India will look like in 2035. So our demographic profile is very comfortable even till 2050, because we're going to be a growing country, a young country. Young people produce, they save, they consume. That's very important. Old people don't spend. Old people have savings, they don't produce. Young people have no savings, they don't consume, but they consume and they produce nothing. So these two people at the top and at the bottom, if these people increase over this, then your economy is slowing down. Thank you. Next, please. China is increasing dependency rates. The total dependency will start going to 64%. 39% of its population will be old age and 25% of its population will be young. This is coming down. So this will start rising. Now, this is China's aging problem now, and why it has to grow very fast. And when China starts slowing down, things will start slowing down in the world for all of us also. Life expectancy has doubled from 35 in 49 to 75 today. It was a miraculous achievement. The fertility rate also has plummeted. Now that is a problem, far below the 2.1 needed to keep population stable. But China has got a declining population. It has moved from labor surplus to labor shortage in the fastest pace in history. Labor shortage means wages go up. Wages go up means exports start coming down. In 2011, its workforce shrank for the first time, years before anyone had predicted. If workforce shrinks, it'll have to get more productive and go into the higher value addition chain. So China is producing more sophisticated goods where it's competing with Japan and Europe. So the conclusion is that China will be old before it gets rich like America. So there is a limit to China's growth because how its demography is changing. Next, please. India's dependency ratio look pretty good. Till 2050, we're doing okay. The only change, upward movement trajectory takes place in 2045. But I'll tell you this much. This is also not correct. These ratios are going to actually get better because we told the WHO that we will stop growing by 2030, that our population will stabilize at $1.44 billion. And that's not happening. Actually, I did a paper some years ago on Indian population growth. We will keep growing till 2090. That's the good news. This ratio will keep coming down. But the bad news is that the South will stop growing. The North will stop growing, that's Punjab and Haryana. The West will stop growing, Bombay, Maharashtra and Gujarat. Who will be growing? Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh to some extent, and Rajasthan. So what we call the Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Professor Raj Krishna gave it an acronym and called it BIMARU. The BIMARU will be growing till 2019. So you're going to have internal problems. What is going to happen is when the population of UP is young, population of Bihar is young, they will start migrating to the south. Already you see Kerala has its migrant population is 9.5% of its total population. Kerala has got zero population growth. Tamil Nadu has reached close to that. Karnataka is getting close to that. Telangana will be last, but we will also stop growing by about another 6-7 years. So you'll have to import labor. And you're seeing labor from Orissa, labor from Bihar, labor from Jharkhand, labor from UP in Hyderabad, in Madras, in Cochin, in Bangalore, all over the country. Even in district headquarters now you have imported labor from other parts of India. You know, this whole thing about Bangladesh sending labor is rubbish. Actually, when Bangladesh's per capita income is going to go past us in 2024, we will start sending people to Bangladesh instead of Bangladesh labor coming here. The problem in India is in the northern states. They are just growing in terms of people with no economic growth. So people are going to keep flowing out. Did you see when the lockdown took place, where were people heading? They were heading to East UP and Bihar. Now, so India might look very good in terms of world financial systems. Demographic dividend is going to kick us in our teeth if we don't set things in UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh to some extent, Rajasthan, and Orissa, set things in order there. And this is where our problems come from. Not this, the dependency factor is very good. And if we don't sort that out, we will miss this chance. If this window of opportunity goes, it will never come back for another 200 years. The world's population will go up, then come down, and then start rising again. It goes in that cycle. And so we'll have to wait for 200 years to get this window of opportunity. Now, this is the age of the middle class. The rise of the middle class is the big phenomenon in the world. Asia is predicted to add 2.5 billion people to the world's middle classes in the next 20 years. Middle class in China and India are growing at an extraordinary rate. China's middle class could swell to 50% of its population in just the next 12 years. India's middle class would rise even more rapidly because Indian households will benefit more from Indian growth than do Chinese households, given the distribution of income. Now, what does this mean when the households are growing economically? We need more refrigerators, more air conditioners, more houses, more cars, more motorbikes. The Indian market is going to keep increasing, expanding. So this is an opportunity for marketing people. Now, if you don't create your own brands, if you don't create your own companies, then the benefit of the value addition will go to foreign economies. Now, Haier, he's got a Chinese brand name. He repatriates money back to China, and no Indian company is there in the refrigerator market anymore. At one time, we had Alvin, Godrej. This is something which, as managing people, you should consider. If you don't have your own brands, then you don't get all the value addition. Now, Tata will get more value addition than Maruti, because Maruti, Suzuki, is got a huge transfer pricing system. Because Suzuki has not invested money into India because it loves India. Suzuki has invested money into India because it wants to take money from India. And the dividend stream is a small stream. We're only looking at the dividend stream all the time. We're not looking at the value addition which takes place. And the value addition which comes from, now gearboxes used to come from Suzuki till about 2000. And in 2000, some people like me who were in government started asking, why are you importing gearboxes? Why don't you make it here? So now, unless you start forcing these things, unless you start propping up some Indian brands in this, your economy will not get the best. So China has got all its own brands. Chinese car companies are bigger than the American car companies, bigger than German car companies in China. Do you have an Indian car company which is bigger than a foreign car company? You have an Indian car company which is exporting? But these are things, even coffee which goes from India will go under a foreign branding, either Nescafe or Brooke Bond or whatever. The value addition is kept abroad. We'll only sell it as a commodity. But when you turn it into a brand and sell it to people, then you get the value addition. So we're missing out all that. And this is something, I'm not pleading for nationalism, but I'm pleading for some concern on this. But this is something we should be worried about. We can't be an exporter of commodities. You've got to be an exporter of brands. And that India is missing. And finally, what else will reshape the world is the growing urbanization. You see India's urbanization, how it is thickening up. If you're urban, you need a pakka house, you need a fan, you need transportation, you need electricity, you need maybe air conditioning, maybe all kinds of appliances. The more you urbanize, faster you will grow. Now, Chinese urbanization is slowing down. No more urbanization, China, because they've reached a level of high urbanization. Now, this is the difference between India and China. As you see, this is the world's expanding middle class, this dark blue chart, which is rising very high. And this is India is still going up. And this is our friend, the People's Republic of China, where the middle class growth is going to come down. So this is our opportunity. But then I told you, we've got that internal problem hanging over us. If we can't sort it out, if UP can't post economic growth rates, Bihar can't post growth rates, Bihar can't industrialize, Bihar is only an exporter of labor, then outlooks start dimming. And this is the share of world middle class consumption. India's middle class will start consuming more. More of the world's growth will start coming from India. This is how in the perfect world, this is how it is projected to look. But will it continue to look? You see what we did to our economy in the last 5 years. We haven't grown. Demonetization broke our back. Then the hurried imposition of GST after breaking our back with demonetization. And then the coronavirus, the lockdown, and unwillingness to pump prime the economy. When everybody else printed money and added to their deficits, US added 15%, Britain added 22%, Japan added money, EU added money. But India, we were the most conservative. We added only 1.6% of GDP in terms of pump priming. So we're effectively shooting ourselves in our feet. We have a great opportunity. Next, please. So there we are. My story of India, its hopes and its problems. Now I would be quite willing to take questions from you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that extremely profound landscape of the global world GDP. You have looked at last 2 decades and you also looked ahead the next 3 decades, and that's quite comprehensive. I think this masterclass talks about the rise of economic power, how it has changed the power equations in the past, current, and also in future, how it is going to actually affect all of us. And the rise of Asian economies, especially China and India, and a few other economies like Vietnam that you talked about, is of very interesting observation. US is the highest indebtedness in the world as a country. That is another important point that we have taken away. But the young cohorts are going to drive the economy forward, and therefore the demographic balance or the demographic composition is going to be extremely important for us as we move forward. And the rise of middle class, how China is going to be limited by the age factor, and how the middle class is going to rise across China, across the world, and that's going to actually determine and the implication that you have suggested to create your own brands and the implications for marketing is also very interesting takeaway. And the urbanization, the greater the urbanization, greater is the chance of growth for your economy. With these limited observations, I would like to begin the question and answer session. Usually we would like to summarize, but in the interest of time now, I would not like to summarize. There are lots of questions, as many participants have keyed in their questions with us. We have clustered all these into about 4 or 5 important clusters, and then we will alternate between myself and Professor R. Prasad. I will now invoke Professor R. Prasad, who is the Director for Academic Wing at ICFI Group. Professor Prasad, straight away, please start your questions.
Thank you, Professor Rao. Sir, that has been brilliant. In a very, very simple manner, you have communicated to us the dependence on the US, the fact that demographics impacts the economy, the fact that India has a solid advantage there, the fact that India needs to build brands in order to leverage that and keep that money here. I think the flow of thought has been good for us to understand, and I think these are some of these points we normally don't get to understand. We do know that we have a demographic window, but then what to do? I think that part is something that has been communicated clearly here. I'll switch to the question, sir. The first question is about how can corporate India use this advantage to their benefit? Yes, you did indicate about the brands, but if you can elaborate a bit more, sir.
Well, for a start, we have to start exporting more. I would like to see a system where we have corporate balance sheets which indicate a trade deficit, how much you import and how much you export. We can't be an importing country. We can't have trade deficits of $60, $70 billion or $50 billion a year continuously, which means effectively you're devaluing. This whole notion which we are imbibing that import is good is like, saying that tea tastes sweeter with sugar. The more sugar you add, the better, but it'll kill you in the end. So, you got to export, you got to find markets abroad, you got to sell your goods abroad. And this is where the Chinese excel. They sell the entire, there's no country in the world which makes what's this little thing which goes into computers. It all comes from China. 90% of mobile phones, 96% of mobile phones come from China. The Chinese, at one time, Apple and Samsung used to be big brands. But Chinese brands are now bigger than the big two because they allowed manufacturing and learned how to make it. But the courage of the Chinese entrepreneur to go into the market with his own brand, whatever the Oppo, OnePlus or 2+, Redmi, all these White Me or whatever, it's quite remarkable. We haven't had a single brand from India. Look at the cars. This fellow goes and buys a sports car brand in England. He buys the brand, MG, which made small 2-seater sports cars, brings it, takes it to China where he's making a van, a Baijun van in Shanghai, then puts up a car plant in India to make MG Hector or Seltos, what do you call it? Hector. And even the badge is inappropriate. It's a sports car brand, he's selling an SUV. But he's got market share. He's got market share in China, he's got market share here, and he's looking at our market. He's got Chinese companies, what's the other Chinese company which has come now? One more coming very soon. Now, there's no Indian brand left in this, except Tatas. The Tatas have only ramped up quality now. But no Tata car is exported. Cars which are exported from India are Ford, Hyundai, GM when it was there, and Suzuki. Now, Suzuki's exports are very interesting. Suzuki's exports will go to its Japanese agency at cost price and then sold to Israel or in Italy or wherever at a marked up price. So the markup goes out. Same thing is going to happen to tea. Happens in tea. Same thing happens in coffee. Same thing happens in garments. So a brand markup takes place abroad. And this is something you can't afford. You can't. So, Indian entrepreneurs have to up their game. And then rather than, Konosuke Matsushita, after World War II, he was the founder of, Panasonic and National. Matsushita decided himself that this will never happen to Japan again. That there's an American general sitting here at a higher rank than our emperor and telling us what to do. The ignominy of that, he said, should never happen to Japan. So what did he do? He started making television sets, radio sets. The first thing is he makes a television set. He goes to America and buys up the biggest television manufacturer, Zenith, and then closes it down and starts exporting television sets to Japan, from Japan to America. Honda and Toyota make more cars in America than Ford does. So this is how you go and capture markets. You treat it as old-fashioned colonialism. In the old days, you went and occupied a country. In the new days, you go and take their market. Now, India is pretty much an occupied country. We don't get rankled by it. We're so globalized and internationalized. We don't care about it. And this is something we should do. And people who create brands or make brands, marketing people, we should be looking at this very carefully. Have we got our own brands? If I were a managing director of an Indian company, I'd worry about not having a brand. If Tata Motors, it owns Jaguar, which makes some of the best cars in the world, but doesn't have a brand recognition in India till last year or so. And there's no other Indian brand. Do you have a brand in air conditioning? I used to run a company which made air conditioning compressors. We made 50,000 compressors a year, and that was 50% of the market 30 years ago. Today, the market for air conditioning is 4 million units a year. 4 million compressors, but 0 compressors made in India. 0. The Prime Minister has appointed a task force headed by Pawan Goenka now of Mahindra's to inquire into how we can create an air conditioning industry in India. We have an air conditioning assembly industry in India. We have a refrigerator assembly industry in India. We don't have, when you make the entire value chain, you make the compressors, you make the parts, then you get huge value additions to the economy. We're in the assembly business. Our industries are in the assembly business. This is something people in manufacturing, people who run companies, chief executives, patriots, everybody's waving, going and seeing the new movie, what's it called? Well, you got to define patriotism again. You got to define nationalism again. So we're quite satisfied with, shouting at Pakistan, launching a few beat-up raids now and then, and think that, that is great nationalism. But nationalism is winning markets. You go to any European supermarket or any American supermarket, you won't see Indian goods there. There might be Indian primary commodities, some, but no goods. Do you have an Indian toothpaste? If you don't have an Indian toothpaste, how will you have Indian toothpaste abroad? The marketing men should be worried about this.
Thank you, sir. I think as a management institution, you have brought up a number of issues here. I think the foremost being the making of brands and how India needs to get its value chain concept together rather than just sticking to assembling, and also how do we instill a sense of pride in ourselves more by creating value rather than other things.
I must have gone to China about 30 times. And what is amazing about China is the pride in themselves. That we do it, we can do it. And I'm seeing the change in China. When I first went to China, it was, little country making small things. But now, if you see the kind of infrastructure they've got, you see the kind of machinery they make, the kind of ships they make, the kind of roads they make, the kind of bridges they lay out. It's quite extraordinary. They think big. And when Modi came to power, he said that we'll build 100 new cities and we'll network the country with bullet trains. And that's the kind of thinking you need. And now he's not able to build a bullet train from Ahmedabad to Bombay. And he's got lost completely. Now, if you look at what happened in the last few hours, and something which makes me feel very sad, he was talking about reforming the agriculture market. Today, the dysfunction you see in international trade You see it in our own agriculture. 90% of Punjab's produce is procured under MSP. 96% of Haryana's produce is procured. And that is 70% of India's procurement. Minimum support price means that a huge subsidy, high price. No procurement in Madhya Pradesh, no procurement in Tamil Nadu, which is a rice growing part, no procurement in Karnataka. There is procurement in Telangana, but he's reduced it by 29% this year, which is why KCR is sitting on dharna. Because procurement is a huge subsidy coming to you. So he's given in to a subsidy. So therefore, I feel that he's losing the plot. He can say the things, but can't do it. Anyway, sorry, that's digressing. That's politics. Management people shouldn't be in politics.
Thank you, sir. The next question is essentially about the startup, the rise of startups and a lot of news that you hear about unicorns that have come up this year. How do you connect that and bridge it to what we have been discussing, sir?
Frankly, I'm an old-fashioned guy. I like to see things made by hand. I like to see a piece of metal twisted around and made into something, into a motorbike or a car or a machine or a thermos flask or whatever. This business of apps and video games and all this stuff, it makes people rich. It makes some people rich. It doesn't. I'll give you stats on this. India has $110 billion of exports of software, IT goods, and it employs about 4 million people. But whereas you have a workforce of 400 million people, so you create narrow bands, silos of economic prosperity and growth. You need to, if you're an economist, you're going to look at the whole country. Corporate people think their responsibility ends with making profits. I think there's little more responsibility to corporate people than making profits.
Right.
So, the startups are not very convinced. It's all a valuation game. Now, this 150 PE kind of ratings is ridiculous. When are these companies ever going to make money? Except take your money.
Thank you, sir. I think you have defined the challenge in this and the problem which the others face, therefore. Due to paucity of time, I'll close this cluster and hand it back to Professor Sudhakar Rao for the next cluster.
Thank you very much, sir. I think it is getting more and more interesting, and the discussion is getting deeper as well, including being wider. I will ask only one question, sir. Of all the things that you presented in terms of the trends in the global economic reshaping and how it is going to change the power equation, what are the implications of that on the following things? One is on personal finance, the second on Indian stock market, and how we're going to envisage the economic divide that we already see in this country. Predominantly these three points.
Yeah, I'll take the stock markets first because something I was looking at today. Now, there is something which I know a little more about because I used to work in the finance ministry. Stock markets go up and down in India, not because of the economy. Not because of the economy. When Dr. Manmohan Singh became Prime Minister, Finance Minister in 1991, you remember how the stock market shot up. There was a certain gentleman called Harshad Mehta, who said, I'm bullish on the Indian economy, and started driving up. And when Dr. Singh was asked about it, and I was one of the people who asked him in a meeting about it, he said it's the sign of confidence in how I'm handling the economy. And the economy was contracting at that time. In the first year of Dr. Singh, the economy contracted 3%. And then it started picking up. And mind you, the economy didn't grow beyond 5.6% till 2000. Stock market has nothing to do in India with the economy. How stock market goes up depends on foreign funds. If foreign funds come in, market goes up. If you look at foreign funds which came in the last 6 months, there's a huge flow of foreign funds coming in, short-term funds, and driving up the Sensex, driving up the Nifty. Did the economy grow? Did corporate profits grow? Corporate profits have come down. Economy has contracted. And why is Sensex going up? Theory tells us that stock markets will boom when people are saving. They go to market to buy shares, and the shares are used, money being raised and being used to invest. That's not happening. It's now a gambler's ring. You drive up, then the foreign institutional investors will book profits, drop the market down by say 10, 12,000 points, and it's bound to go down in the next 3 months by about 60,000. Now it'll go down quite a bit. And then they'll come back again to book profits next time. Take it up, book profits. So we are a milch cow for them to come and milk every now and then. And these are the fellows who are hugely invested in no exchange controls, no. When Chidambaram said that you must have a Tobin tax of 1%, Professor Tobin, who got the Nobel Prize, said you must have a Tobin tax. When money comes in, you tax it. Money goes out, you tax it. Chidambaram proposed 0.25%, and these fellows made such a noise, as if socialism is coming back, and they backed off. Manmohan Singh's government was notable for backing down very quickly, and they backed off. But you got to slow the ingress and exit of foreign institutional finance. Foreign direct investment is very different from FII, whereas we tend to bundle them together and say foreign investment going. How much is FDI? And how much of FDI is coming to buy greenfield, set up greenfield industries? How much of FDI is coming to buy existing companies? These are things which you should disaggregate and look. And corporate people should start looking at these things. You don't look at these things, you're only looking at bottom line. And so corporate people need to start looking at things like Matsushita did. And incidentally, when Matsushita died, there were 5 presidents who went to his funeral. President Bush, President Clinton, the British Prime Minister, and the Japanese Prime Minister. That's the kind of power and influence the corporate chairman developed in Japan. And when are we going to have a corporate chief who's going to be like that? So only these people will change countries. And management institutions like you has to provide such people. You've got to make people bold, daring, go on and make something.
Right, sir. Thank you very much for that response. Again, in the interest of time, what I'll do is I'll now invite Sanjay to ask his question. Sanjay, quickly, if you can put it together, and we will save more time for the speaker.
I should warn you about Sanjay. He normally has 3 or 4 questions bundled in one.
Yeah, you have to ask only one.
I have
question,
only
Sanjay.
one, sir. Thanks a lot for a wonderful presentation. I mean, I was grappling for data, and I think most of the kids over here might be still grappling to understand the data that has been thrown at them so quickly and so fast. In fact, it is like Thompson from the older days coming on to bowl to the Indians. I had just one particular question which I had posed earlier, sir, and which Sudhakar also has, which could be modified and has been answered partially. The focus on education, which needs to be the core to build value in the society, is what is going to be the driver for the future for the Bimaru belt. Unless and until politics aligns with that, and our roti, kapda, makan, healthcare, and education are actually addressing skilling as well as value addition opportunities in all these sectors, along with our macroeconomic index put in place, the old input-output matrix story that we talk about. Unless and until we actually focus it in that particular manner and have credible data to achieve all these things, whatever we might want to do with all our demographic dividend will actually lead us nowhere. So what would be your advice to the current set of leaders and also the politicians, the decision makers, to let the flow of the people not be arrested?
I think the most important thing is the biggest problem with India is that our politics are adversarial. We don't talk. You look at the flip-flops. UPA wanted GST, NDA opposed it. NDA comes to power, adopts GST, UPA opposes it. So you can't have such kind of politics. You got to take people into confidence. as a build consensus that these things we will do together. And you can't run politics, a government, a country in perpetual election fighting mode. You can't keep fighting all the time. You've got to have debate. You've got to have discussion. And all we have today is assaults. Even today, 7 years after he's in power, Modi is still remembering Jawaharlal. You can't keep doing this forever. Once you can do it, 2014, 2015, 16, now it is counterproductive. It's not going to work. You got to set right the country. What are you doing? Why is the vaccination rate so low? If your vaccination rate is down to 35 lakhs a day instead of 1 million a day, when are you going to complete 100 million? If you don't vaccinate your people, the third wave of corona comes is going to destroy the economy. The third wave has begun in Germany, in Austria. Austria shut down today. Germany is shutting down. It will come to us sooner because you are allowing air travel to come in as of yesterday. You know what happened between Wuhan first shutdown and our shutdown is 8 million travelers, 8 lakh travelers came from all these countries. So the pattern was very interesting. From China, you go to Iran. From Iran, Indian pilgrims go to Qom. They bring the virus to India. Somebody else comes from Indonesia, brings the virus to India. Somebody goes to London. Delta virus began in London, came back to us. It began in India, went to London, and came back to us. Now it's gone to South Africa, it's gone to South America, it's gone to America, everywhere. So you can't stop this virus. The only way you can stop it is vaccinate. And you're falling short in vaccination, not short of vaccine. Now, you're short of the act of vaccinating. We just slowed down. There's no war footing on this. And just give, and unless you start cooperating with other parties, other factions in your system, you're not going to get this. I should like to see the Congress party go out and say, telling everybody vaccinate, for heaven's sake, vaccinate. But Congress party won't do it because they'll think of it as helping Modi. But in the end, it only destroys us. So there's so many places where we could have, for instance, on the China border, we could have a consensus on what the border is. Does anybody here know what the Constitution of India looked like? Constitution of India came with a map. If you look at the map, Aksai Chin is not there. When Aksai Chin came into Indian map, it was a story by itself. Why can't we have a consensus? Are we ever going to get Aksai Chin back? Are you going to go to war with Pakistan to get POK back? Anybody who said POK, who's looked at the terrain and who's looked at satellite maps, you can never get it back. You will need 2 million men to go and march in to take the place. There's an old military saying that mountains eat up men. So we are engrossed with all these things. There's no consensus on anything. Because if Prime Minister Modi gives a little let, Rahul Gandhi will jump on him. And if Rahul Gandhi, by some quirk of fate or some wrong deal of fate, becomes Prime Minister, Modi will jump on him. So we need consensus in our system, like you need consensus in companies. In companies where you have a lot of politicking, you have very little growth. So you need the Japanese Ringisho system, where people keep consulting all the time. We don't have a forum where our leaders can sit and talk. These guys don't even socialize. When Jawaharlal Nehru was Prime Minister, when Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister, opposition people went there and socialized. They went to dinners and around. Rashtrapati Bhavan dinners, leaders of opposition were invited. So you mixed around, you spoke privately on a few things. These people are divided, they don't talk to each other. They walk away. I've seen this happen myself. Prime Minister Vajpayee used to call people to his house to meet and to discuss. He could pick up a phone and talk to an opposition chief minister and say, "Ye kya kar rahe hain aap? Isko rehne dijiye na." I see him say that. So if you are divided like this, you will never set right your economy. My first advice to Sanjay, since you can talk to Prime Minister Modi, is to conciliate.
Right, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much for that answer and advice that we need to have a lot of cooperation and also consensus in our leadership, especially political leadership. The Japanese leadership skills is what we are lacking, or we are required to have. Forum for consultation and socializing is always required. Thank you very much for that, sir. I quickly, before I close my cluster, what I'll do is I'll quickly request Ms. Anita Raman to ask a question very, very quickly. You have to take less than a minute to pose that question. Ms. Anita Raman.
Yes, sir. I think, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So good evening, sir, for a wonderful, wonderful session. So my question is, you had a very critical observation of how many of the economies are parking their reserves in USD. Okay. Although Euro had been given a competition, tough competition during 2000, but we still find that most of our country's reserves are going into USD. Now, SDRs, which were as an alternative for some time, but still, do you have any suggestions as to where we could invest our reserves so that it would be more productive and contributing?
If you ask me where we should put our reserves, put it in American banks. This is safest there. Are you going to put your reserves in China? Are you going to put it with anybody else? You put your money into a bank you trust.
Right.
Okay, that is the harsh reality. But also know the reality of that bank, that bank is heavily indebted. So you expect periodic shocks. But there's no other alternative right now. So that bank is not going to let another bank come. Even when a little fellow like Colonel Gaddafi said, I'm going to keep my reserves in gold. You know what happened to him? The US will protect that dollar, the primacy of the dollar, till death. Even the Chinese today dare not do it. You have no choice. Enjoy yourself. But also remember that there's a basic weakness in the structure. It's like builders who build tall buildings with small foundation. Earthquake comes, going to fall.
Right, sir. Thank you very much. I have one small question before I hand it over to Professor Prasad for the next cluster. What is your commentary on the cryptocurrencies that is the buzz at this point in time?
I think it's bogus.
Sorry, sir?
I think it's bogus.
Bogus.
The way of, everybody says, values go. Today one fellow went up by 70,000%. What is the cryptocurrency? Some guy says, this is my Bitcoin. He's not backed it up with anything. He's not backed it up with an economy. He's not an authorized central bank. Value is going up. Wonderful. So you can say I'm a fool because you're missing the chance of opportunity. But I would never invest in something which is so patently bogus. I'm sorry, a lot of young people are invested in cryptocurrency. Prime Minister also chaired a meeting yesterday on cryptocurrency. Patently bogus. Chinese have banned it, say that it's an anti-national activity. And your money could grow tomorrow from, like this fellow grew from 70,000%. Can you imagine a 70,000% growth? If I were running government, I'd say lock the fellow up. But
great, great. So
I'm sorry.
No problem. I think you're very clear. You're very clear when you said you would never invest in anything that is so patently bogus. So that is going to remain etched in our minds. What I'll quickly do is I'll hand it over to Professor Prasad to probably pick up one or two questions in the next cluster. We are already striking 9 p.m. So that's an alert. Professor Prasad.
Thank you. I think I'm going to get the focus back to practitioners. The corporate India doesn't seem to be doing what it is supposed to do. Hopefully it will. Government policies not in our control, politics not in our control. So I'll come back to the young India, the entrepreneurs, and also focus back on the question of employment, which is where the solution lies. I mean, a stable solution lies. So the question is, what kind of industries, business ideas for employment and branding, if you put together, where is the potential lying? I mean, what can the young guys who are listening in here think about, do about, teach about, so that there is something, some light at the end of the tunnel here?
No. For young people, I always say that you have an obligation to better your life. You have an obligation to rise in your management hierarchies. You have an obligation to become rich. You have an obligation to have families. You have an obligation to consume and all that. Do that by all means. But out of every 100, you must have 2 leaders, or 3 leaders, guys who beat a different path. We're beating all of our chaps into conformity. You're not getting any new entrepreneurs. What you're providing, the world is hustlers, Bitcoin, e-commerce, app, this and that, which no tangible value except for themselves. Value addition is a very different thing. Value addition to a service, to a product is very different. I think you should teach them that. I think notions of how there are different kinds of value additions. So for instance, the value addition from Indian IT exports is almost $110 billion. With nothing you create software from the air. You're getting work, you fill it up, send it back. So what you invested in a computer, some Wi-Fi and all the stuff, you created value addition. The Chinese, for all their huge industry, their value addition is only 37 or 40% of ours in terms of their merchandise goods export. But what that value addition does, it creates employment for 280 million people. And that is the kind of differences I think we need to teach. I think policy analysis becomes very important.
Thank you, sir. I think value addition, which creates employment, and the necessary additional information and skills to achieve that. This is what educational institutions should be focusing on. Thank you. I think with that question, I get back to Professor Sudhakar Rao.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sir, we are at 9 p.m. So I am little scared of the time that I have sought from you, and I have retained you for a longer time than what I initially asked for. However, I would like to open it for one question from the audience, and after that we'll wind it up. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have one brilliant question, you will come up. If it is not brilliant, we'll not allow it. Just kidding. Please feel free to ask the question.
India now holding almost 3% of the wealth, the world wealth, and the population is 17.7%. And at the same time, China population, it is 17.8% and holding the wealth of 23% of the world. Now, if we can see with the almost the same population, China, it is now 20 times ahead of India. Okay. At the same time, China population growth is 3%, but Indian population growth 18%.
No.
18% at this juncture, because some of the for every 100 births at this juncture, India accountability is 15. Maybe I am partially wrong, but it is more than 15, in between 15 to 18 for every 100 births at this juncture. However, as far as my concern, we are almost since last 15 years, what we are using the buzzword of demographic dividend, we are not used in a good manner. And next we have only around 15 to 20 years of period. Okay. In this 15 to 20 years of period, there is a skill gap. Okay. Because our productivity almost occupies 17.7% of the population. Still our productivity, it is 3% of the wealth. So this kind of gap, how in our society, how we are going to fill these gaps in the next 20 years. These are all the big challenges. Of course, government side a lot can do, but individually also, what you can suggest at individual level, as you are observing so many economies in the world.
Clearly, some of your numbers are off, but it's okay. General point is there that We can't be like this for long. We have a short window of opportunity, 30 years or so. And in that, we've got to pick up and grow. Okay? And we distribute our wealth, educate our people, increase lifestyles, life expectancy, improve lifestyle. A lot of things to be done, short period of time. 30 years is nothing in a nation's life. 30, 40 years just goes by. But how do you start it? What we have, something which I shouldn't be saying, but I'd like to see 1 million mutinies in the country, everybody challenging the system and saying, why is this way? We don't fight for our rights. We don't fight for responsive government. When the garbage outside your house is not picked up, you don't say anything. When Bijli gets cut, you don't say anything. We become mutinous once in a while. But you got to be mutinous all the time. That means you are not accepting the status quo. It's a very different thing, There's no input-output model to get an economy going. After all these years of giving Nobel Prizes for economics, the Nobel Prize committee has now come down to behavioral economy. How do you change people's behavior? How do you study people's behavior? People don't behave in very rational terms economically. So therefore why does a man want to be, in the old days, want to be a king or a commander-in-chief, who about seizing power? It's some drive in them. And I'd like to see management schools create people with drive, an ambition to excel, ambition for some greatness. So I'd like to see that. And unless you do that, you will not get the growth which you are talking about. If you go to China, you see that drive in people. Even a small fellow will be selling something. When I first went to China, the first thing I noticed was one guy, fellow selling a small flower pot with a plastic flower in it, which had a small solar motor in it, and the flower kept open and closed. That is fascinating. And he was selling it for, 10 yuan or some ridiculous amount. See, all the things which they sell on our payments, string lights. Can't we make string lights here? These are the things which actually somebody sent me a remarkable film yesterday on how the Chinese improvise on small things. Also the little bit, when Honda went to America and they started selling cars and the market share kept increasing, Ford analyzed why they were not buying Ford cars. They had a huge research team, went out. They found out that people were buying Honda cars because you got a place to put your coffee when you're driving the car. The Japanese fellows realized that Americans go drive 20 kilometers or 30 kilometers a day to work and they have coffee in the car. So they created a place for cup. So people are buying them, but people are not going to say, I'm buying that Honda because of the cup. Then they say it's got a better engine, got a better shape, all that. But the number one reason was when you did serious research, there was a mug holder. Then they had a place to put your file, to put your thermos flask. And it took the Americans 10 years to come up with a place to put a mug. And that's innovation. So that's the kind of leadership you need. Small things. Corporate people need that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. I think we have come to an end of this amazing session. And you started with the dependence of the world on US economy or as a country in US and how the global trade imbalance is continuing and how various other factors are going to reshape this in the next 2 to 3 decades in terms of demographics, in terms of rising middle class, in terms of urbanization. From there, you have very succinctly highlighted the action points or insightful actions for the corporates and the young people, both in this country and around the world. And pinpointedly, you measured that we need new kind of leadership both at political level as well as at the corporate level. At political level, a consultation politics, and at corporate level, try and provide new entrepreneurs, leadership that will aspire better, leadership that looks into creating new entrepreneurs rather than hustlers. I think these are very, very important insights that you have given us. And also, you touched upon the mindset of the people in general, how they will have to behave, keep questioning for your rights, fight for your rights, and seek responsive governments. And then the leadership exhibited by Japanese organizations is something where we can take a cue from. The pride in yourself that you can do is most widely displayed in China. That is what is required here. Therefore, the definition of the patriotism or the nationalism is basically to create value or add value, rather than talking about narrow terms of patriotism. I think it's a wonderful session. All in all, we will not be able to summarize this in the short span of time that we have, but this recorded session will help us in arriving at a summary. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to put the summary also on archives on our website. You can peacefully go through that, and the summary will help you take away more easily all the points and the insights shared by Mr. Mohan Guruswamy today in this amazing session. Sir, we can't thank you enough for your time and the value addition that you have provided to us. We felt that this platform is too small for the largest of the talk that you have delivered. I am very, very happy, and I'm sure all the members around the screen are also equally happy for having listened to you. So on behalf of Professor Prasad, on behalf of our Vice Chancellor and everyone in the ICFI system, we wholeheartedly thank you, sir, for this wonderful session that you have delivered. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will also mention that next Friday we are going to meet again at 7:30 p.m. Mr. Nilesh Shah, the founder and CEO of Envision Capital, is going to deliver a talk and also have an interesting conversation. So tune in. We will see you next Friday, 26th of November at 7:30 p.m. Thank you all for enriching this conversation with your very, very interesting questions. We are always falling short of time when we have a very big guest like this as Mr. Mohan Guruswamy, but we'll try and see how we can capture everything in the summary, which I promised will be there on our archives. Once again, thank you all. Thank you all for making this masterclass so very interesting and so very insightful. Thank you, sir.